What's up, friends? It's Jimmy here, just asking you to hit the like and subscribe buttons and the notification bell, and turn on all notifications. Also, before we begin, drop a comment down below and let me know where you're listening from. This might not seem like much, but it really helps me in the algorithm. Anyway, with all that said, let's strap in for some unsolved mysteries. It was a scene of quintessential English summer festivity. On Sunday, July 13th, 1980, the Hollandwell Showground in Nottinghamshire was alive with the buzz of competition and community. 11 jazz bands, comprising around 500 children from across the East Midlands, had gathered for a charity jamboree. Dressed in bright uniforms, they stood on the clipped turf, instruments gleaming, ready to perform. Many had traveled for hours by coach, and were a bundle of nerves and excitement, the air filled with the sounds of practice and anticipation. But just as the day's events got underway, something went terribly wrong. At around 10:30 a.m., without warning, a child collapsed. Then another, and another. The music faltered, replaced by a ripple of confusion and then panic. One witness described the scene as children, quote, falling down like 9 pins, a surreal and terrifying spectacle that transformed the festive green into a field of horror. The emergency response was swift and massive. 4 local hospitals were placed on high alert as ambulances ferried casualties from the showground. In total, 259 people were hospitalized, and 9 children were kept in overnight for observation. The total number of victims was estimated to be around 300, a figure that included not just the young band members, but also some adults, and even infants in strollers. The inclusion of these latter groups would become a critical point of contention for those who disputed the official explanation later offered. The symptoms themselves were a strange mix. The most dramatic and common were fainting, dizziness, nausea, and vomiting. Many also complained of sore eyes, burning throats, and headaches. Some accounts were even more bizarre and specific. One young girl described a sensation that her arms and legs had no bones in them, while another victim was seen with white foam coming from her mouth. Several people reported a strange, unpleasant taste in the air. The physical environment became a key focus of suspicion. Some witnesses recalled the grass having an unusual blue tint or noticing a strange smell, which was variously compared to onions or bleach. Yet, these sensory clues were not universally experienced. A press photographer who was on the field throughout the incident later stated he saw and smelled nothing out of the ordinary. This inconsistency doesn't necessarily disprove an environmental cause. It could point to variable exposure due to wind or uneven application of a substance. The authorities quickly ruled out common culprits like food poisoning or contaminated water, as many who fell ill hadn't eaten or drunk the same things. With obvious causes dismissed, suspicion fell on something more insidious: chemical exposure from crop spraying in a nearby field. This theory gained significant traction years later when a 2003 investigation revealed that a pesticide named Calixin had been used locally around the time of the incident. Calixin's active ingredient is the fungicide Tridemorph, a chemical that was subsequently banned by the British government in 2000 due to health concerns. A review of Tridemorph's toxicological profile reveals a compelling, if incomplete, match with the events at Hollandwell. The chemical is known to be harmful if inhaled or swallowed, and is a recognized irritant to the skin and eyes. Acute exposure can cause nausea, vomiting, and respiratory discomfort, symptoms that align closely with those reported by many of the victims. The witness reports of burning throats, sore eyes, and a chemical taste in the air suddenly seem to have a plausible scientific basis. However, the pesticide theory has significant flaws. The most glaring is its selectivity. Some people were ill while others right beside them were totally fine. A toxic cloud dense enough to incapacitate 300 people would likely have affected a much larger proportion of the attendees, according to experts. Secondly, the rapid recovery of most victims, with the majority discharged from the hospital within 24 hours, seems inconsistent with severe chemical poisoning. Finally, in the more than 4 decades since, there have been no documented long-term health consequences or clusters of chronic illness among the victims. After a joint inquiry, Ashfield District Council and the Nottinghamshire Police arrived at a startling conclusion. They ruled that the cause of the Hollandwell incident was an incredibly rare epidemic of mass hysteria. Today, this phenomenon is more precisely termed mass psychogenic illness. MPI involves the unconscious manifestation of real physical symptoms, fainting, nausea, headaches, in response to a potent psychological stressor. The conditions at the showground were a textbook recipe for such an outbreak. The children were a cohesive group, organized into their respective bands. They were under significant stress, being tired from travel and anxious about their competitive performances. The initial unexplained collapse of a few children provided a dramatic and frightening trigger. The illness then likely spread via social contagion. The sight and sound of others falling ill created a wave of fear that became a self-fulfilling prophecy. This contagion was almost certainly amplified by official announcements over the PA system. A photographer at the scene recalled a chilling pattern. An announcer would warn people not to eat the ice cream, and children eating ice cream would faint. Then a warning about the water was issued, and those who had been drinking it started to collapse. These well-intentioned warnings likely acted as a powerful nocebo effect, the opposite of a placebo, where the suggestion of harm creates a genuine negative physical reaction. The authorities, trying to identify a threat, inadvertently gave the crowd's free-floating anxiety a series of concrete targets. The enduring mystery of the Hollandwell incident may be that it doesn't have a single simple cause. The evidence doesn't demand a binary choice between a chemical agent and a psychological phenomenon. Instead, the most compelling explanation is an integrated one: a mild environmental irritant, likely the pesticide tridmorph, caused genuine physical symptoms in a few children. These initial cases, grounded in a real toxicological reaction, then served as a powerful and credible trigger for a massive wave of mass psychogenic illness. This integrated hypothesis resolves the major contradictions. It accounts for the real physical symptoms like burning throats and nausea that are hard to explain by psychology alone. It also explains why not everyone was affected and why most recovered quickly, which is inconsistent with widespread poisoning. It acknowledges that the symptoms were absolutely real, whether their origin was ultimately in the lungs or in the mind. Further, it explains how babies, who are necessarily immune to mass psychogenic illness, were also affected. Ultimately, the legacy of Hollandwell is one of uncertainty, fueled by a critical institutional failure. It was confirmed years later that an official report on the incident was produced, but has since been lost, a fact that has cemented a narrative of a cover-up in the minds of many victims. It's not every day you see someone dancing in the middle of a freeway. Yet on one September afternoon in 1992, drivers in Port Hueneme, California encountered exactly that. A young woman twirling on a road's median as cars whizzed by. A concerned motorist stopped and took her to a nearby police station for help. There, the mystery deepened. The woman couldn't speak or understand the officers. She responded only with blank looks and gestures. She had no identification, only a bank receipt from San Diego that led nowhere. After hours of fruitless questioning, police had no choice but to release her back to the street. For all intents and purposes, This unidentified young woman was alone in the world, seemingly abandoned by whoever had once looked after her. Remarkably, the very next day, the same woman was found wandering again, looking just as confused. And I just realized I wrote remarkably in my script for perhaps one of the most unremarkable things to ever have occurred. What did they honestly think was going to happen to this woman by just tossing her out onto the street like that? This time, authorities placed her in a women's shelter rather than leaving her on her own. Shelter staff quickly realized she couldn't tell them her name or story. They were struck by how profoundly isolated her world was, since she could neither read, write, nor speak in any normal way. She relied on improvised sign-like motions and even scribbled gibberish when given a pen. A communication specialist was brought in and managed to get her to spell out something resembling Lucy. The name was spelled Luxci, which they pronounced as Lucy since it was the closest name they knew that looked vaguely like that. When shown these letters written down, the woman smiled and reacted with delight, so they began calling her that for lack of any other name. Over the next few weeks, patient efforts yielded a few fragments of Lucy's history. She indicated through gestures that she was 23 years old. She also signaled that she had arrived in California on an airplane and that she'd had a baby who was no longer with her. Doctors confirmed she had given birth not long before she was found, backing up her claim about a lost child. Staff observed that Lucy kept herself clean and followed basic daily routines, suggesting she had been cared for by someone until relatively recently. She even wore a ring with the letter S on it, possibly indicating the name of her missing baby. Despite these clues, however, extensive checks of missing person reports and databases found no one who matched Lucy's description. In early 1993, her plight was even featured on Unsolved Mysteries in hopes that a viewer might recognize her, but no useful leads emerged. It was as if she had appeared out of nowhere, with no paper trail or past anyone could find. By late 1992, with her identity still unknown, Lucy was moved to a residential home for developmentally disabled adults who needed full-time care. There, a startling discovery was made. Lucy wasn't actually fully deaf as had been believed. In one incident, a balloon popped and she visibly flinched, leading to formal hearing tests which showed she could hear relatively normally. Her muteness and strange communication were attributed instead to cognitive impairments and a lack of language development during childhood. Essentially, although she was in her 20s, she functioned at the level of a young child in terms of communication ability. This, along with the lack of records of her existence, paints the image of her having a child in an extremely sinister light. For a few months, Lucy stayed under supervised care, but in mid-1993, she ran away from the care home and vanished once again. That winter, in December 1993, a breakthrough of sorts occurred in an unlikely place, Cotati, a small town in Northern California. Police there found a mute, confused homeless woman sleeping on a sidewalk and realized it was Lucy, now nearly 400 miles from where she had first been discovered. How she got there remains unclear. When found in Cotati, she was carrying a small amount of meth, so authorities held her briefly while trying to find her identity. The renewed publicity led to many calls and tips from the public, yet still no one could positively identify her. Authorities marveled that someone so impaired could survive largely on her own. After being released from custody, Lucy slipped away again, disappearing from official records. In the years that followed, unconfirmed sightings of Lucy continued to surface. According to some local reports, she was seen around Ventura County, for example in Santa Paula, as late as 2014, living among homeless communities. Witnesses noted her habit of pushing a cart of belongings and communicating mostly with grunts or gestures. These accounts, however, were never verified, and officially the trail has gone cold. Personally, I question whether these later sightings were actually her, given that I find it difficult that she could have made it on her own for that length of time given her level of disability. Many theories have been proposed over the years to explain who Lucy might be and how she ended up in such tragic circumstances. Given the hints that Lucy had a baby taken from her and her apparent wariness around men, some suspect she was a victim of trafficking. In this scenario, she may have come from another country, perhaps in Latin America. Under this theory, she may have been trafficked when she was very young, which may explain why she never developed language abilities. Unfortunately, I think this may be the tragic and disturbing reality of Lucy's case. Another theory is that Lucy was the dependent of a family who became unable to care for her, or that may have been subjecting her to horrific acts. She may have had developmental disabilities from birth, and her family could have kept her at home under lock and key. The case of Lucy remains a haunting, unsolved mystery. She is essentially an unidentified person who was found alive yet never linked to any known identity or family. Despite national media exposure and exhaustive efforts by authorities, her real name and background were never discovered. Notably, it's unclear if there are any genetic samples from Lucy preserved, but if there are, she may one day be identified. Unfortunately, though, whatever the case, Lucy slipped through the cracks of the system and likely ended up living on the streets the rest of her days. However, if it's true that her family was involved in the disturbing treatment she evidently received, there may be some quantum of justice for Lucy coming one day. Every year, thousands of pilgrims travel to the St. Thomas Church in Leipzig, Germany, drawn by the promise of standing in the presence of genius. They gather in the church's chancel, where a large bronze plaque set into the floor marks the grave of Johann Sebastian Bach. It's a solemn, powerful experience to be so close to the man who composed some of the most sublime music in human history. But this hallowed ground is built on a foundation of historical ambiguity, 19th century nationalistic fervor, and scientific theories that have long since crumbled. In a surprising twist, the skeleton beneath the floor may not be Bach at all, and the story of how it got there is a winding, century-and-a-half-long mystery. The story begins not with reverence but with neglect. When Johann Sebastian Bach died from a stroke on July 28, 1750, he was a respected local figure in Leipzig. He was a brilliant organist and former music director, but he wasn't widely known throughout Europe or even the Holy Roman Empire. 3 days after his death, his body was placed in an oak coffin and buried without ceremony in the Johannesfriedhof, the old St. John's Cemetery, just outside the city walls. Like most burials of the era, his grave was left unmarked, and within a few years, its exact location had been completely forgotten. The Johannesfriedhof was a poor choice for a lasting memorial. Established in the 13th century as a burial ground for a leper hospital, it was a chaotic, overcrowded space with a turbulent history. It had been used as a military camp during Napoleon's time, with soldiers reportedly burning old coffins for firewood. Locating a single unmarked grave from 150 years prior seemed like an impossible task. Yet 2 fragile clues survived. The first was an archival note indicating Bach was buried in an oak coffin, a distinction given to only 12 of the 1,400 people who died in Leipzig that year. The second was a piece of oral tradition that only surfaced around the time of the search itself in 1894. It claimed Bach's grave was located 6 paces from the south door of St. John's Church. This tradition, however, was incredibly tenuous, originating from a 75-year-old man who said he'd been told the spot 60 years earlier by a 90-year-old gardener. Nobody else amongst the living had remembered this so-called tradition, aside from this one old man. By the late 19th century, a full-blown Bach revival was sweeping across Europe. Composers like Mendelssohn had championed his work, transforming him from a respected but somewhat obscure Baroque master into a German national hero. From there, his fame quickly rose outside his native land, and he quickly became accepted as one of the most talented composers in history. Musical pilgrims flocked to Leipzig, but there was no grave to visit, no central shrine for their adoration. The planned rebuilding of the Johanneskirche in 1894 provided the perfect opportunity to rectify this. A committee was formed, driven by civic and national pride, to find the composer's lost remains. The excavation that began in October 1894 was anything but a scientific undertaking. In fact, it looks like the team in charge took the notes from Heinrich Schliemann and applied them to this German archaeological site. Wilhelm Hiss, a professor of anatomy leading the effort, described the scene as a muddy pit filled with a heap of bones. After finding and discarding several pine coffins, they unearthed 3 oak caskets. The first contained a young woman. The second oak coffin was accidentally smashed to pieces by an overzealous excavator. But the third, found on October 22nd, held the well-preserved skeleton of an elderly man. In an environment of immense expectation, the conclusion was immediate and decisive. This had to be Bach. The search was driven not by impartial inquiry, but by a fervent desire for success, making it highly susceptible to confirmation bias. With a candidate skeleton secured, the task of proving its identity fell to science, or what passed for it at the time. Wilhelm Hiss took the lead, focusing his analysis on the skull, and offered the most 19th century scientific explanation you can imagine. He declared the skull had sturdy and strong features befitting a man of distinction, or what modern observers call the argument from Giga-Chaddism. All joking aside, though, known depictions from Bach's life do depict him as a bit of a Chad, so perhaps not the worst argument of all time given the person involved. Hiss even argued that certain features of the temporal bone suggested a highly developed sense of hearing, a trait one might expect in a great composer. This claim was called out by other experts even at the time, so he resorted to other ways to scientifically prove Bach was in the bones. He then commissioned a sculptor to quote-unquote recreate what the skull looked like in life, using known portraits of Bach as a guide during the process. Unsurprisingly, the bust came out looking entirely like the great composer himself. This logic was entirely circular. The reconstruction looked like Bach because it was made to look like Bach, because it was done with reference to the great master. Half a century later, the bones were examined again before their final move. This time, a surgeon named Wolfgang Rosenthal noticed something new. He found abnormal bony growths, or exostoses, on the skeleton's pelvis and at muscle attachment points on the arms. He hypothesized that these were the result of occupational stress from a lifetime of playing the organ, a physically demanding activity involving repetitive foot and arm movements. To test his theory, he X-rayed 11 living professional organists and claimed they all showed similar growths. He proudly announced the discovery of a new ailment, Organistenkrankheit, or organist's disease, and declared the skeleton's identity confirmed beyond doubt. I know this might be trite to say, but I really do love how in German you can just easily create a new, insanely specific word by cobbling a bunch of different words together. Like Wilhelm Hiss's theory, Rosenthal's was a compelling story, but it was also proven to be wrong. In a 2007 study published in the Medical Journal of Australia, researchers replicated his experiment, but added a crucial element: a control group of non-musicians. Their findings dismantled the theory completely. Only a third of the organists had the bony growths, while 75% of the non-organ playing control group did. The growths were simply common signs of aging and physical activity, not a unique marker of organists. Rosenthal's irreproducible disease was discredited, removing the last piece of supposed scientific evidence for the skeleton's identity. But let's get back to what happened after the bones were quote-unquote proved to be those of Bach. Despite the shaky identification, the bones were treated as sacred relics to one of the most talented people in history. In 1900, they were placed in a grand stone sarcophagus and interred in a crypt beneath the altar of the rebuilt St. John's Church. On December 4th, 1943, Allied bombs rained down on Leipzig, and St. John's was destroyed. In a twist of fate that only deepened the legend, the crypt somehow survived the inferno, and the sarcophagus was recovered from the ruins in 1949, its contents unharmed. This miraculous preservation set the stage for the final chapter of their journey. On July 28, 1950, the 200th anniversary of Bach's death, the remains were moved to their present location in St. Thomas Church. This is the very place where Bach had worked as music director for 27 years. The reinterment was a major state event in what was then East Germany, with the new bronze grave cover sponsored by the Soviet Union. This was a political act that claimed Bach's legacy for the new regime and was implicitly an act of reconciliation between the Soviets and their new German satellite state. Today, there is no scientific consensus that the remains in St. Thomas Church are those of Johann Sebastian Bach. In fact, most modern assessments conclude that it's highly unlikely. The entire case rests on a chain of weak links: a dubious oral tradition, a chaotic and biased excavation, and two discredited scientific theories. By the standards of modern forensic anthropology, the identification process of 1894 was appallingly inadequate, lacking proper documentation, site mapping, or a chain of custody. There is one tool that could likely solve this mystery for good: genetic analysis. A comparison between DNA extracted from the skeleton and that from the known remains of one of Bach's sons could provide a definitive answer. While analyzing antique DNA is challenging due to degradation and contamination, modern techniques are increasingly capable of such feats. Yet, no test has ever been done. To date, the church authorities at St. Thomas have refused all requests for DNA analysis, including a formal scientific proposal. And so, the mystery endures. The skeleton in the chancel of St. Thomas Church remains a powerful symbol, a physical link to a transcendent artist. But whether it is a true relic, or simply the anonymous remains of a Leipzig citizen caught up in a story of national pride, we may never know. Perhaps in the end, it doesn't matter. Bach's true, incorruptible remains aren't buried in Leipzig. They're encoded in the notes of the Mass in B minor and the Brandenburg Concertos, among numerous other works, a legacy that needs no bones to prove its immortality. Hey everyone, Jimmy here with a reminder to hit the notification bell and turn on all notifications and click that share button and send it to your friends and family. Also, don't forget to hit that join button or follow the Patreon link if you want to toss a buck or two my way, or get your name up on the shout-out screen. In the vast, sun-scorched expanse of Nevada's Mojave Desert, within the Ash Meadows National Wildlife Refuge, there's a small, fenced-off patch of rock. To the casual observer, it looks like little more than a crack in the earth. But this unassuming fissure is a portal to another world. It's the entrance to Devil's Hole, a water-filled limestone cavern of unmapped depths. This is a geothermal window into a vast subterranean aquifer where water that fell as rain or snow thousands of years ago finally returns to the light. The water is a constant, bath-like 93 degrees Fahrenheit, and it's home to what is arguably the rarest, most geographically isolated fish on the entire planet, the Devil's Hole pupfish. This tiny creature, whose entire existence plays out in this single watery cavern, raises the compelling mystery of how it even got there and how it continues to survive. The Devil's Hole pupfish is a marvel of evolutionary tenacity packed into a tiny and extremely inbred frame. Rarely growing more than an inch long, the males are a startling iridescent blue, flashing like scattered jewels in the cavern's twilight. The females and juveniles are a more subdued yellowish brown. They get their name from the playful, darting way they move, reminiscent of frolicking puppies. Their entire world is a shallow, submerged limestone shelf, measuring just 215 square feet, upon which the whole species depends for feeding and spawning. This ledge is their continent, their ocean, their absolutely everything. Life on this shelf is lived at the absolute edge of biological possibility. The water's constant 93 degrees Fahrenheit temperature is paired with critically low dissolved oxygen levels, hovering around 2.5 milligrams per liter. This is a combination that would be lethal to most fish, but the pupfish soldiers on. Their diet is meager, consisting of algae, diatoms, and the few tiny invertebrates like snails and beetles that can survive there. This food source dwindles dramatically during the winter months when direct sunlight no longer reaches the water's surface to fuel algal growth. This forces the fish to endure a period of near starvation, and with a rapid life cycle of only 10 to 14 months, every generation faces the same precarious struggle. The story for most other pupfish species in the American Southwest is a relatively straightforward one. During the Pleistocene epoch, a much wetter period, vast lakes and interconnected rivers covered the landscape. As the last ice age ended and the climate grew hotter and drier around 10,000 years ago, these massive bodies of water evaporated, leaving behind small, isolated springs and pools. Fish populations that were once connected became stranded in these aquatic islands, and over millennia, they evolved into the distinct species we see today. For decades, scientists assumed the Devil's Hole pupfish was the ultimate example of this process, a species isolated for 10,000 to 20,000 years in its cavernous refuge. But there's a critical flaw in that narrative. Geological and hydrological studies have revealed that Devil's Hole is fundamentally different. It's not the remnant of a surface lake. It's a deep tectonic fault, a fissure that opened to the surface roughly 60,000 years ago. Crucially, there's no evidence that it was ever connected by surface water to the ancient lakes or the other springs in the area. It is fed from below by a massive regional aquifer, but it has always been a geological island. If the fish weren't simply left behind when the waters receded, they must have arrived by some other means. The question isn't just when they got there, but how these fish out of water crossed hot, dry land. This geological reality has ignited a fierce scientific debate, fueled by the disruptive power of modern genetics. The first major challenge came from population viability models and genetic analyses. This suggested a tiny population, which has likely never exceeded 550 individuals, couldn't have survived the effects of inbreeding for 10,000 years or more. Some of these groundbreaking studies proposed a shocking alternative. The pupfish may have colonized Devil's Hole very recently. Interestingly, some estimates place their arrival at as little as about 100 years ago. This theory suggests that the pupfish's unique physical traits might not be the product of long, slow evolution, but rather a rapid developmental response to the extreme environment. However, the debate is far from settled. Other high-resolution genomic studies have swung the pendulum in the opposite direction, arguing for a much more ancient origin. This research suggests the pupfish may have diverged from its relatives around 60,000 years ago, nearly the same time that the cavern itself is thought to have opened to the surface. This hypothesis proposes that the geological event that created the habitat and the biological event of the fish's arrival might be linked. The reason for these wildly different estimates comes down to a fundamental uncertainty in genetics: the mutation rate or the speed of the molecular clock. The pupfish's extreme environment, high metabolism, and chronically small population size likely cause its genes to mutate much faster than those of a typical vertebrate. But no one knows the exact rate. Using a standard rate results in an ancient timeline, while using a faster rate points to a very recent arrival. Until the true rate can be measured, the exact age of the Devil's Hole pupfish remains an educated guess, suspended between a few centuries and tens of millennia. If the pupfish are indeed recent arrivals, it forces us to consider seemingly impossible journeys. The leading hypothesis for recent arrival is human introduction. Native Americans in the region were known to utilize pupfish as a food source, and it's plausible that they transported them to Devil's Hole. Scientists who have proposed this theory believe they may have stocked this area with the fish intentionally to establish a new food supply on an ancient trade route. If they were ancient arrivals, one possibility is that they were transported by birds. Their sticky, millimeter-sized fish eggs could have hitched a ride on the feathers or feet of waterfowl traveling between isolated oases. Whether it's an ancient survivor that has defied the laws of population genetics for millennia, or a recent colonist that arrived by improbable means, remains unknown. Interestingly, recent genomic work has confirmed that the pupfish is one of the most inbred animals on Earth, with 58% of its genome being identical across individuals. This genetic uniformity makes its continued survival all the more remarkable, and its future all the more fragile. Around 600 BC, an unusual sight unfolded on Egypt's Red Sea coast. A squadron of Phoenician ships preparing to sail into the unknown, commissioned by the pharaoh himself. Their mission was unbelievable: to keep going south and west, attempting to do what no one in their world had done before: circumnavigate Africa and successfully return home. If the story is true, it means that 2 millennia before the Age of Discovery, ancient mariners may have already achieved what later explorers heralded as a groundbreaking feat. Notably, the Greek historian Herodotus recorded the account, and even he found it hard to believe. Yet, intriguingly, one detail the Phoenician sailors reported: something about the position of the sun during their journey, hints that the story might just be true. Modern historians are now left to wonder whether these ancient Phoenicians, sailing for Egypt, truly accomplished the impossible, or whether this is a legend that has been embellished over time. Necho II, who ruled from 610 to 595, was an ambitious pharaoh of Egypt's 26th dynasty. His kingdom, recently free from Assyrian domination, was eager to reclaim its power on the world stage. Necho fought major conflicts in the Near East against rising powers like Babylonia, but after defeats he shifted focus to bold infrastructure and maritime projects. One grand endeavor was his attempt to dig a canal linking the Nile to the Red Sea, essentially a forerunner of the Suez Canal. Though that canal was never completed, both due to cost and the risk of his enemies using it as well, it shows Necho's vision of Egypt as a trading and naval power. While earlier pharaohs sent ships to trade with the land of Punt on Africa's eastern coast, no recorded Egyptian voyage had ever pushed beyond those known waters into the open ocean. Necho took unprecedented steps to build up a navy, but despite being a visionary, he realized that naval tradition is built up over generations, not over the course of a few years. Luckily for him, the Egyptians were the immediate neighbors of the greatest mariners in the ancient world. Necho recruited veteran mariners from Phoenicia to man his fleets on the Mediterranean and Red Sea coasts. Notably, Egypt and the Phoenician city-states also shared a common rival in Babylon, which made them natural partners in exploration and enterprise. In this context, Necho set in motion an extraordinary expedition to answer a daring question. Could sailors depart Egypt, sail south and west, and come back around Africa to the Nile? Herodotus, writing about 150 years after Necho's reign, provides the principal account of this voyage, and he likely heard the tale from Egyptian priests. Herodotus relates that Necho's hired Phoenician sailors set out from Egypt's Red Sea coast and headed south, hugging the coast as they navigated into unknown waters. They took nearly 3 years to return, sailing in stages and coming ashore each autumn to sow grain and replenish their food before continuing onward. In the end, the crew passed westward through the Pillars of Heracles, now known as the Strait of Gibraltar, and sailed back into the Nile Delta. According to Herodotus, they became the first to prove that Africa was surrounded by sea, rather than linked to Asia, as commonly believed. The sailors brought back one astonishing report. At one point in the far south, the sun appeared to the north of them, to the right of their ship, as they sailed west. Interestingly, this detail, which is now the best evidence in favor of the historicity of this event, was seen in a very different light by Herodotus. He found that he couldn't believe this detail, yet it's precisely what would happen to observers voyaging below the equator, lending some credence to the story. Apart from Herodotus's narrative, no contemporary record confirms the voyage. Many later writers in antiquity were skeptical that such a circumnavigation ever occurred. By the Roman era, for example, geographers like Ptolemy still argued that Africa's southern oceans were landlocked. This is a sign that if the Phoenicians did sail around Africa, their feat was not widely believed. Not long after Necho's time, the Carthaginian explorer Hanno voyaged down the African west coast, though his crew went beyond the Gulf of Guinea before turning back. Unlike the voyage sponsored by Necho, Hanno the Navigator, as he's known to history, wrote a first-person account of his journey, which survives till this day in a Greek translation. Herodotus also tells of a Persian who was ordered by Xerxes to sail from the Atlantic around Africa, though this journey is much more speculative than the other expeditions. In modern times, historians continue to debate whether this Egyptian-sponsored Phoenician circumnavigation really happened. Many consider Herodotus's report plausible, noting that the Phoenicians retained by Necho certainly had the skills and ships to attempt it. The reported 3-year duration, and that extraordinary sun on the right observation, align with what we now know would occur on a southward journey around Africa. Ancient vessels could ride seasonal winds and currents to slowly make their way around the Cape, and the Phoenicians were adept at long-distance seafaring. On the other hand, some scholars remain skeptical. They emphasize the lack of corroborating evidence and question why Necho would fund a costly voyage of discovery with no obvious immediate payoff. However, historians have also observed that Necho was the sort of visionary ruler who tried to build the Suez Canal more than 2 millennia before it was actually constructed. He may have imagined that this voyage would open up new trade routes that would have brought untold riches to Egypt. Notably, the Egyptians traded heavily with the land of Punt, in what is now Somalia, and may have seen this ability to navigate around Africa as a means to cut them out. Further, when he ordered the voyage, he of course had no idea how long it would take. While the Mediterranean and Red Sea portion of the trip would have been known, the rest was essentially guesswork, and it wasn't clear that they wouldn't just hit land going south. Surprisingly, the voyage has actually been tested in modern times. From 2008 to 2010, explorer Philip Beale and a team sailed a replica 6th century Phoenician ship around Africa, duplicating the route described by Herodotus. This voyage that took them about 2 years roughly mirrored the ancient timeline, when accounting for the fact they didn't drop anchor to farm new supplies. This experiment proved that a ship from Nico's era could theoretically manage the voyage. While it can't confirm the story directly, it lends circumstantial credibility by showing the feat was technically feasible. But this circumstantial evidence needs to be taken into account with that tidbit about the sun that Herodotus found impossible. In 600 BC, no Near Eastern or Mediterranean society had worked out the concept of an equator where the sun could appear in the northern sky. That detail in Herodotus, dismissed by him as unbelievable, makes sense precisely because it would have astonished sailors who lacked any prior theoretical expectation. Adding even more credibility to the account, Herodotus noted that this event occurred at the furthest southern point. The quote-unquote unusual position of the sun would only have become apparent the further south the sailors went. In short, this is strong circumstantial evidence to suggest that the voyagers likely made it at least as far as the Cape of Good Hope, since they couldn't have known this fact otherwise. This, of course, doesn't definitively prove that they completed the circumnavigation from that point onwards. However, if they didn't complete the circumnavigation, it begs the question why the ancient voyage took roughly the same time as the modern reenactment. Whether Pharaoh Necho's African circumnavigation happened or not, the legend has secured a place in the history of exploration. If the voyage was real, it stands as one of humanity's great maritime achievements. It would push back the first known journey around the whole African continent by 2 millennia. It also means the initial credit for pioneering the Cape route belongs not to the Portuguese explorers of the 15th century, but to a band of Phoenician sailors under an Egyptian king. Even if the story was exaggerated or apocryphal, it may have inspired the well-documented epic voyage of Hanno the Navigator about a century later. It may also explain why Hanno's first-hand account of that voyage was secretive in relation to certain details. Perhaps the Carthaginians believed that the Egyptians, with the help of their Phoenician forebearers, may still be interested in the route around Africa. While I previously discussed circumstantial evidence, there's still the potential for definitive proof that the expedition was factual to be found. Herodotus doesn't specify how many ships took part in the voyage, though he does mention that sailors went out in ships, plural. Because of this omission, modern historians can only speculate on how many ships might have been involved. Most tend to assume it was a small expedition of a handful of ships at most. This estimate is based on practical concerns, as a small fleet would have been easier to supply and easier to maneuver along unknown coastlines. Definitive proof of Necho's Phoenician circumnavigation would need artifacts that unambiguously connect 6th century BC Phoenicians to coastlines far beyond the Red Sea and Mediterranean. The strongest candidate would be a Phoenician shipwreck found off southern Africa or on the Atlantic coast. This, of course, would be a very unlikely find, given the passage of time, and the fact that we don't even know if any of the ships were lost on the voyage. A second line of evidence would be the coastal landing sites. According to Herodotus, the Phoenicians set up temporary communities to farm and resupply. Perhaps the best possible evidence would be an out-of-place Phoenician inscription located somewhere in southern or western Africa. Phoenician sailors occasionally left behind graffiti or other inscriptions, and such an inscription, carved into an immovable object and dated from around that time, would be irrefutable evidence. Whether Necho's expedition occurred remains one of ancient history's greatest unsolved mysteries. While it can't be proven beyond a reasonable doubt, the circumstantial evidence suggests that on a balance of probabilities, the Phoenician crew likely at least made it to the Cape of Good Hope.